Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is KRT, Critical Race Theory. It's not the one they teach in law school, but the one banned in public schools. In this episode, we cover the Atlantic Race Riot of 1906. Episode 1, copyright 2022. After the end of the American Civil War and during the Reconstruction era, there was violence of whites against blacks throughout the South, as whites reacted to emancipation of blacks, accusations of black criminality, and political empowerment of freedmen, specifically gaining the voting franchise, which led to political power and representation. Having former slaves become equals was threatening to their ideals of racial supremacy. Increased tension also resulted from whites competing with blacks for wages and the idea of paying for labor, which had been free for centuries. Atlanta had developed rapidly, attracting workers for its rebuilding, and particularly from the 1880s as the rail hub of the South. Workers from all over the country began to flood the city. This resulted in a dramatic increase in both the African American population, which was from 9,000 in 1880 to 35,000 in 1900. And as individuals from rural areas and small towns sought better economic opportunities, the overall city population grew from 89,000 in 1900 to 150,000 in 1910. With this influx and the subsequent increase in the demand for resources, race relations in Atlanta became increasingly strained in the crowded city. Whites expanded Jim Crow segregation in residential neighborhoods and on public transportation. Freedmen and their descendants had gained the franchise during Reconstruction, and whites increasingly feared and resented their exercise of political power. African Americans had established prosperous businesses and developed an elite who distinguished themselves from working class blacks. Now, some whites resented them. Among the successful black businessmen was Alonzo Herndon. He owned and operated a large, refined barbershop that served prominent white men. This new status brought increased competition between blacks and whites for jobs and heightened class distinctions. The police and fire department were still exclusively white, as were most employees in the city and county governments. State requirements from 1877 limited black voting through poll taxes, record keeping, and other devices to impede voter registration, but many freedmen and descendants could still vote. M. Hoke Smith and Clark Howell competed for the Democratic primary nomination for the gubernatorial election of 1906. Both played on racial tensions during their campaigning, in which Smith had explicitly campaigned on a platform to disenfranchise black voters in Georgia. Sounds familiar? Howell was also looking to exclude them from politics. Smith was a former publisher of the Atlantic Journal, and Howell was the editor of the Atlantic Constitution. The Atlantic Journal and the Atlantic Constitution. And today we have the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Both candidates used their influence to incite white voters and help spread the fear that whites may not maintain the current social order. These papers and others attacked saloons and bars that were run and frequented by black citizens. Whites called them dives and were said to have nude pictures of women. The Atlanta Georgian and the Atlanta News publicized police reports of white women who were allegedly sexually molested and raped by black men. The stage production of The Klansman in Atlanta was a contributing factor to that city's race riot. In Savannah, where it opened next, police and military were on high alert and present on every streetcar going toward the theater. Authorities in Macon, where the play was next to open, asked for it not to be permitted, and it was not. On Saturday afternoon, September 22, 1906, Atlanta newspapers reported 4 sexual assaults on local white women, allegedly by black men. A grand jury later indicted 2 for the rape of Ethel Lawrence and her niece, Mabel Lawrence. Following this report, several dozen white men and boys began gathering in gangs. They began to beat, stab, and shoot black people in retaliation, pulling them off or assaulting them on streetcars. It started in the 5 Points section of downtown. After extra editions of the paper were printed, by midnight, estimates were that 10,000 to 15,000 white men and boys had gathered throughout downtown streets and were roaming to attack black people. By 10 p.m., the first 3 blacks had been killed and more were being treated in the hospital, and at least 5 of them would die. 3 of them were women. Governor Joseph M. Terrell called out 8 companies of the 5th Infantry and 1 battery of light artillery. By 2:30 a.m., some 25 to 30 blacks were reported dead, with many more injured. They closed the trolley lines before midnight to reduce movement, hoping to discourage the mobs and offering some protection to the African American neighborhoods. That's because whites were going there and attacking people in their houses or driving them outside. Alonzo Herndon's barbershop was among the first targets of the white mob, and the fine fittings were destroyed. Individual black men were killed on the steps of the U.S. Post Office and inside the Marion Hotel, where a crowd chased one. During that night, a large mob attacked Decatur Street, the center of black restaurants and saloons. The mob destroyed businesses and assaulted any black people within sight. Next, mobs moved to Peter Street and related neighborhoods to wreak more damage. Then it began to rain heavy from 3 a.m. to 5 a.m., which helped suppress the fever for rioting. The next day, which was Sunday, events were quickly publicized as violence continued against black people, and the massacre was covered internationally. Le Petit Journal of Paris reported, quote, "Black men and women were thrown from trolley cars, assaulted with clubs, and pelted with stones." By the next day, the New York Times reported that at least 25 to 30 black people and women were killed, with 90 injured. 1 white man was reported killed and about 10 injured. An unknown and disputed number of black people were killed on the street and in their shops, and many were injured. In the center of the city, the militia was seen by 1 a.m., but most were not armed and organized until 6 a.m., when more were posted in the business district. Sporadic violence had continued in the late night in distant quarters of the city as small groups operated. On Sunday, hundreds of black people left the city by train and other means, seeking safety at a distance. A group of African Americans met in the Brownsville community south of downtown near Clark University to discuss actions. They had armed themselves for defense. Fulton County Police learned of the meeting and raided it. An officer was killed in the ensuing shootout. These militia companies were sent to Brownsville, where they arrested and disarmed about 250 blacks, including university professors. The New York Times reported that when Mayor James G. Woodward was asked about the measures taken to prevent a race riot, he replied, "The best way to prevent a race riot depends entirely upon the cause. If your inquiry has anything to do with the present situation in Atlanta, then I would say the only remedy is to remove the cause. As long as the black brutes assault our white women, just so long will they be unceremoniously dealt with." He had gone around the city on Saturday night trying to calm the mobs, but was ignored. On Monday and Tuesday, city officials, businessmen, clergy, and the press called for an end to violence because it was damaging Atlanta's image as a thriving New South city. Indeed, the massacre had been covered throughout the United States as well as internationally. Fears of continued disorder prompted some white civic leaders to seek a dialogue with black elites, establishing a rare biracial tradition that convinced mainstream northern whites that racial reconciliation was possible in the South without national intervention. Paired with black fears of renewed violence, however, the interracial cooperation exacerbated black social divisions as the black elite sought to distance itself from the lower class and its interest. leaving the city among the most segregated and socially stratified in the nation. Its aftermath saw a depression of Atlanta's black community and economy. The riot contributed to the passage of statewide prohibition and black suffrage restriction by 1908. Sound familiar? Although it had a profound effect on many of those who experienced it, the riot was forgotten or minimized for decades in the white community and ignored in official histories of the city. Well, as I said earlier, you won't find this story in your child's history book. This has been episode 1 of Critical Race Theory. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time for the next one.